Whenever a baby is born, one of the things that always generates a lot of discussion is the question, who does she look like? You know, her mother or her father? Because all of us carry the DNA of our parents, which means that we tend to resemble them in our physical characteristics. But it's not just the physical DNA that gets passed on, it's also the spiritual DNA. There's an old proverb that says the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, which simply suggests as children grow up with their parents and watch the way they behave, they tend to become like them in the way they speak and the way they act and in the way they think. You know, those of us who are parents, I think we've all had those moments when we've said something like, shut the door, you know, were you born in a barn? Or if everybody else jumped off a cliff, would you do it too? And then we thought, oh no, I've turned into my father or I've turned into my mother. And there are patterns in our families that get repeated generation after generation, which can be a good thing if we're instilling Christian values in our children, but unfortunately it can also be a bad thing. Somebody once said there's nothing more contagious than a bad example. Some behaviors, you know, some sins in families get perpetuated by that contagious bad example. Now, it doesn't have to be that way. It's not a curse that God places on a family. That cycle can be broken by the grace of God. But there are many behaviors that are perpetuated in families where the behavior of the parents results in that same behavior in their children or grandchildren. And we see this in the life of King David. There were plenty of things in David's life that were bad examples for his children. We've already talked about how David committed adultery. He killed the husband of the woman who he had an affair with. He placed other troops in harm's way, taking their lives in a staged battle. And those actions had consequences in his children's lives. There's another interesting phrase that's used several times in the Old Testament. 4 times God said, I forgive iniquity, rebellion, and sin, but I do not excuse the guilty. I lay the sins of the parents upon their children and grandchildren. The entire family is affected, even children in their 3rd and 4th generations. Now, this was prophesied by Nathan when he stood in front of King David and said to him, you're guilty of sin. And then he said, from this time on, your family will live by the sword. Because of what you have done, I will cause your own household to rebel against you. And basically, Nathan said, David, you're going to reap what you have sown. And he certainly did. David had a son named Amnon who raped his half-sister Tamar. And as a result, another of David's sons, Absalom, hated Amnon and murdered him. And then, as we saw in our sermon last week, Absalom intended to overthrow his father's kingdom. Absalom was a clever politician. He said to the people, you know, if I was in charge, things would be different. Your life would be so much better. And the Bible tells us that he stole the hearts of the men of Israel. Now, he didn't win their hearts. He stole their hearts by deceiving them. And after Absalom gained support enough among the people, he started his rebellion. He had trumpets blown all throughout the land of Israel, and the announcement was made, Absalom has been crowned king in Hebron. When we left off last week, Absalom was on his way to Jerusalem to occupy the throne of his father, and David had fled. Once again, David became a fugitive on the run. And I would have to say that he was pretty good at being on the run. He spent 10 years of his life running from King Saul. He knew the land like the back of his hand. He knew where all of the good hiding spots were, where all of the caves were. And so David leaves Jerusalem. He heads towards the wilderness. And meanwhile, one of his most trusted advisors, a man by the name of Ahithophel, switched sides and went to work for Absalom. He was a turncoat, a traitor, and now he's working for Absalom, the rebellious son. And so David spoke with one of his other trusted advisors, a man named Hushai, who wanted to leave town with David. And David said to him, "If you go with me, you will only be a burden. Return to Jerusalem and tell Absalom, I will now be your advisor, O king, just as I was your father's advisor in the past. Then you can frustrate and counter Ahithophel's advice. Zadok and Abiathar, the priest, will be there. Tell them about the plans being made in the king's palace, and they will send their sons to tell me what is going on." And so David said to Hushai, "What I really want and need more than anything else are some eyes and some ears inside that palace. And I'd like for you to be a part of this undercover operation. Pretend to be on Absalom's side, and then whenever you find out what he's planning to do, get the word out to me." And that brings us now to 2 Samuel chapter 16, where David is on his way to the wilderness and he encounters two men. First, he meets Ziba. Verse 1 reads, "When David had gone a little beyond the summit of the Mount of Olives, Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth, was waiting there for him. He had 2 donkeys loaded with 200 loaves of bread, 100 clusters of raisins, 100 bunches of summer fruit, and a wineskin full of wine." And so let me help you picture the scene here. When David and his family and his men left Jerusalem, they headed toward Jericho, toward the Dead Sea area and out into the wilderness. Now, the path that they took would have taken them down into the Kidron Valley, and then they would have climbed up the Mount of Olives, which was a pretty significant height. But when David gets over the top of the Mount of Olives, there was Ziba waiting for him. Ziba was the servant of Mephibosheth. And you may recall that Mephibosheth was the son of Jonathan, who was the son of King Saul. We talked about this in a previous message. Mephibosheth was crippled. But after David became king, as a favor to his good friend Jonathan, David invited Mephibosheth to come live in the palace with him and to eat with him at the royal table. And he provided him with everything he needed. It was just a beautiful story of grace. And so now we've got Ziba, who was Mephibosheth's servant, basically his caretaker. And he's waiting for David on the side of the road. And he's got all of this stuff, all of these supplies, 200 loaves of bread, 100 clusters of raisins, 100 summer fruits, this skin of wine. And David and his followers fled from Jerusalem so quickly, they wouldn't have had time to gather much in the way of provisions. And so the sight of all of this good food and drink must have seemed like a blessing from God, which is exactly what Ziba intended David to believe. It goes on and he says here, "What are these for?" the king asked Ziba. And Ziba replied, "The donkeys are for the king's people to ride on, and the bread and the summer fruit are for the young men to eat. The wine is for those who become exhausted in the wilderness." And so at this point, it looks like Ziba is this great guy. I mean, what a nice gesture. King David has a long road ahead of him, and he has this large household to feed. It's a long and difficult journey, and so the donkeys will certainly come in handy. Let's continue the story. "And where is Mephibosheth, Saul's grandson?" the king asked him. "Oh, he stayed in Jerusalem," Ziba replied. "He said, 'Today I will get back the kingdom of my grandfather Saul.'" So Ziba says to David, "I just want you to know that, hey, I'm loyal to you. I really want to help take care of you. I know this journey is going to be difficult for you, and so I'm here to support you in any way that I can. But Mephibosheth, man, he's back there in Jerusalem because he thinks he's got a shot at getting the kingdom back." And David is devastated by this news. And I'm sure he thought, after everything I did for Mephibosheth, I let him live in the palace. I let him eat at the royal table. I gave him everything he needed. And this is the way he repays me? I can't believe he would turn on me. And so David said to Ziba, "In that case, I give you everything Mephibosheth owns." "I bow before you," Ziba replied. "May I always be pleasing to you, my lord the king." And so it looks like Ziba is this great guy and Mephibosheth is this scoundrel. However, we're going to find out later on that everything Ziba said was this big fat lie. The truth is, Mephibosheth wanted to leave with David, but when he asked Ziba to get him a donkey, Ziba wouldn't do it. And because Mephibosheth was crippled in his feet, he wasn't able to leave. Ziba intended to capitalize on the political unrest and David's emotional distress to manipulate the situation to his own advantage. And it's obvious that David believed this man's report way too quickly. He should have asked him some follow-up questions, and maybe he would have gotten to the truth. You know, there are a couple of proverbs that come to mind for me. In Proverbs 14, Solomon said, "Only simpletons believe everything they're told, but the prudent carefully consider their steps." And so don't be too quick to believe the allegations that are brought against another person. And then in Proverbs chapter 18, Solomon said, "The first to speak in court sounds right until the cross-examination begins." And we've all had it happen, you know, where somebody comes to us and they tell us a story about what somebody else did to them, and we're ready to believe the worst about that person until we hear the other side of the story, and oftentimes that changes things. Well, that's what's going on here. Ziba tells his side of the story, and David believes him. But later on, Mephibosheth will come before King David, and he will tell him the truth about what actually happened, and David will come to understand that Ziba was actually lying to him. But we got to keep in mind that David was in the midst of a crisis. His mind was clouded by his emotional distress. And when our world is caving in on us, that can distort our judgment, and that can make us willing to believe things we wouldn't otherwise believe. You know, to accept things we wouldn't otherwise accept, to trust people we wouldn't otherwise trust, and to doubt the people that we should be trusting. David had misjudged Mephibosheth. And perhaps it was partly because he had already been betrayed by his own son and his trusted advisor, Ahithophel. And so everyone seemed to be turning against him. And David was just ready to believe the worst. I mean, even Mephibosheth has turned against me. How prone we are to believe the worst when we're going through difficult times. And I think there's a lesson here for all of us. David made a judgment based on first impressions. It appeared to him that Mephibosheth was ungrateful. It seemed that Ziba was loyal. But David completely misjudged Mephibosheth, a man who loved him deeply and was only ever loyal to him. He did it because he believed the word of a man who turned out to be a scoundrel. Is there perhaps an area in your life where you might be tempted to rush to judgment? Where you might be tempted to jump to conclusions without having all of the facts? Where you might be tempted to make a judgment about someone without really knowing what's in their heart? We live in a world that is just filled with rumor, gossip, all kinds of spin. And if we rush to judgment on every accusation that we hear, we're going to fall into the same trap that David did. I mean, this was a difficult time for King David. Think about what he must have been feeling. He's been rejected by the city that he loved. He's been rejected by his own son, Absalom. He's been betrayed by his closest advisor. And David had to be thinking, it can't get much worse than this. But it does. Somebody says, hey, Mephibosheth, that guy that you were so kind to, he's back in Jerusalem and he's joined in with Absalom too. And even though it wasn't true, David didn't know that. And it would have made him feel even worse. And so now you're thinking, things have just got to get better. It can't get any worse than this. But it does. Because David has an encounter with another person on his way to the wilderness. And that brings us to Shimei. Look at verse 5 of 2 Samuel 16. As King David came to Bahurim, a man came out of the village cursing them. It was Shimei, son of Gera, from the same clan of Saul's family. He threw stones at the king and the king's officers and all the mighty warriors who surrounded him. And so the path that David is taking is leading through the territory that belonged to the tribe of Benjamin. That was the tribe that King Saul was from. It's been about 25 years since David replaced Saul as king, but some of the people of Benjamin just never got over it. Some issues just seem to never go away. Old wounds can remain close to the surface, and it doesn't take much for them to be reopened. And I think that's how it was for the extended family of the house of Saul when it came to David. David was the king. The house of Saul may not have liked it, but there was nothing they could do about it. And they got on with their lives. But Absalom's rebellion opened up all those old wounds and all those hard feelings. One of Saul's family members was Shimei, a man who was filled with hatred towards David. Shimei was a true partisan. He could see no bad in Saul, and he could see no good in David. And we're told that when David came to this village, that Shimei came out and cursed continually. This man had a foul mouth. He could hardly put a sentence together without cursing. His mouth just spewed hatred that filled his heart, and all of his hatred was directed toward King David. And picture David and all of his people walking along the path in the valley. Shimei is on a ridge above them, kind of stalking them as they walked. And from up on that ridge, he's shouting these curses, and he's throwing these stones, and he's flinging dirt at them. Apparently, this kind of behavior, the throwing of rocks, is still in existence in that part of the world even today, for the simple reason that for a lot of people, that's their only weapon. And that weapon is in great abundance in Israel. There are just stones everywhere. But put yourself in David's shoes. He's lost the love of his son and the support of his people. He's been driven from his home and from his throne. And as if that wasn't bad enough, now he has to listen to this guy shouting curses at him. In verse 7, he says this, he says, "Get out of here, you murderer, you scoundrel," he shouted at David. "The Lord is paying you back for all the bloodshed in Saul's clan. You stole his throne, and now the Lord has given it to your son Absalom. At last you will taste some of your own medicine, for you are a murderer." And so Shimei accused David of being a murderer. Now we know that David was a murderer. He in essence killed Uriah. But that's not what Shimei is talking about. He is accusing David of murdering King Saul, which wasn't true at all. King Saul died in a battle at the hands of the Philistines. And in fact, when David had the opportunity to kill King Saul, you might remember that he refused to do it. And so what Shimei said was completely wrong. David did not murder King Saul, and he didn't steal the throne. So David has to listen to all this slander as Shimei is up here on this ridge just throwing a temper tantrum. But it wasn't just David listening to this. David was surrounded by his mighty men who were more than happy to deal with this situation. Look at verse 9. "Why should this dead dog curse my lord the king?" Abishai, son of Zeruiah, demanded. "Let me go over and cut off his head." Now, Abishai was the brother of Joab, the commander of David's army. And they were both these fierce warriors. And so Abishai said, "David, you're the king. Nobody should treat you like this. Let me go shut this guy up and cut off his head." And I think he would have if David had not intervened. What would you have said, I mean, think about a person who's maybe a thorn in your side. How relieved would you be if that person wasn't around anymore? If you didn't have to deal with all of their garbage? How tempting it must have been for David to say, all right, deal with it. I mean, all he had to do was just say the word and it would have been all over for Shimei. But David wouldn't do that. Instead, David said, no. If the Lord has told him to curse me, who are you to stop him? Then David said to Abishai and to all his servants, my own son is trying to kill me. Doesn't this relative of Saul have even more reason to do so? Leave him alone and let him curse, for the Lord has told him to do it. And perhaps the Lord will see that I'm being wronged and will bless me because of these curses today. And so David ignored Shimei. And Shimei just kept on doing what he was doing. So David and his men continued down the road. And Shimei kept pace with them on a nearby hillside, cursing and throwing stones and dirt at David. It's interesting that David didn't do anything about being cursed and having these rocks thrown at him. And perhaps it was because David was still dealing with the guilt of what he had done. But the accusations that Shimei made against David weren't true. David wasn't guilty of the blood of the house of Saul, but he did have the blood of Uriah on his hands. And so maybe he thought, I didn't do what he's accusing me of, but I have sinned enough that I deserve to be cursed. And you know what? You have to admire anyone who's willing to listen to his critics. It's hard for us to listen to those who criticize us, but it's important for us to do so. Don't just listen to the people who always sing your praises. I mean, it's dangerous to listen to only people who tell you how awesome and how amazing you are. It's good to be willing to listen to your critics as David did. He said, you know what? God could be in this. Maybe I need to hear this. And I think there's something here for all of us to learn. Whenever we're criticized, we ought to listen to it and pray about it and say, Lord, is there something here you want me to address or to be aware of? And it's a good idea to go to someone who knows you well, someone who will be honest with you and to say, what do you think? Is there something here that I need to work on? And then you can either respond to the criticism or you can ignore it. But once again, as we've so often seen, David is passive and does nothing. But this time, I think it's a good thing. You know, somebody has suggested what David did here was even more impressive than his victory over Goliath. That's the story we all want to remember, isn't it? You know, David and Goliath. And without a doubt, that was a great victory. But in Proverbs chapter 16, Solomon wrote, he who is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than he who takes a city. And so maybe this was a greater victory than even killing Goliath. I mean, anybody can get angry and go into battle, but to be able to hold your peace when you know what the person is saying about you is wrong, that takes real strength. And David had a lot of practice at this. Remember when Saul threw a spear at David? What did David do? He ducked. Now, the spear was stuck in the wall behind him. And David is a far better aim than King Saul was. David could easily, pull out that spear and throw it back in Saul, and David wouldn't have missed. But David didn't do it. What did Jesus do when they spat on him and yelled at him and put him on that cross? The scripture tells us he did not retaliate when he was insulted, nor threaten revenge when he suffered. He left his case in the hands of God, who always judges fairly. And like Jesus, David said, just let it be. You just walk away. Don't do anything about it. Well, what's next? I'll take a look at verse 15. Meanwhile, Absalom and all the army of Israel arrived at Jerusalem, accompanied by Ahithophel. This, without a doubt, had to have been one of the lowest points in David's life. He's been rejected by his people. He's been kicked out of Jerusalem. He's a man on the run. His own son has rebelled against him. His most trusted advisor is now on the other side. There's a guy throwing rocks at him and cursing him. And then because Ziba lied to him, he thinks that Mephibosheth has turned against him. And so at this point in time, David had to feel that everybody was against him. And his world was caving in, and he was at his absolute lowest. And so what do you do when you're at your lowest? What do you do when the whole world seemingly turns against you and everything is going wrong? You worship God. You worship God. That's what David did. Let me just read this to you. This is from Psalm 3, and we have this superscription under it to begin with that says, a psalm of David regarding the time David fled from his son Absalom. And so David is on his way out of Jerusalem. He's headed for the wilderness where he can hide. And maybe the first night when they stopped and set up camp, David said, hey, I need just a few minutes to myself. Something's on my heart. I got to write this down. And this is what David wrote. Oh Lord, I have so many enemies. So many are against me. So many are saying God will never rescue him. But you, O Lord, are a shield around me. You are my glory, the one who holds my head high. I cried out to the Lord, and he answered me from his holy mountain. I lay down and slept, yet I woke up in safety, for the Lord was watching over me. I'm not afraid of 10,000 enemies who surround me on every side. Arise, O Lord, rescue me, my God. Victory comes from you, O Lord. May you bless your people. What do you do when you're at your lowest? You worship God. That's what you do. That's why our times of worship together are so very important. We don't gather for worship because it's a fun way to spend a Sunday morning. We don't come here so we can come together with our friends and talk about sports and restaurants. We are here to make a declaration that we have a God who is bigger than any of the problems that we face. That we have a God who will never desert us, even if everyone else in our life does. We need this time of worship to focus our hearts on God, to remind ourselves as we proclaim and sing aloud the truths that never change, that God is good all the time. And so we worship him and we trust him no matter what happens, no matter what anyone else may do to us, no matter what anyone else may say to us, no matter who may turn their back on us, no matter if the whole world seems to be caving in around us, our God is still with us. And in the end, that's all that matters.